Thank you very much to the World Finance Conference in 2025 to allow me to present my research on what moves food prices, the impact of climate change, war, and financial crisis on world food prices. And it is I'm very grateful for my session to enable me to present online today to you. So it's part of a larger project. It started actually in 2016 on mapping climate justice. And in this project, I started thinking about the disparate impact of climate change. The idea was to show that climate change is hitting the world differently in different parts of the world. I had took a macroeconomic data set on the country temperature differences around the world, GDP, gross domestic product compositions per country, factored in agriculture, service, and industry productivity. And then I saw also the top temperature for productivity per GDP sector. And these three ingredients I calculated or put together in a data set for the entire world. And what then comes out is what you can see here, a map of the greener the country is exhibited in this map, the longer the country has time ahead until the country reaches the peak condition for productivity under climate change. And I only did this in order to show the vast inequality that climate change is actually causing. I called it the climate change winners and losers model. And I show that the expected, in a sample of pretty much all over the world, 181 countries, I show that there is a highly significant correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and being on the winning side of climate change. So having a lot of time ahead. So you can see that some countries, and they are colored in green, they not only have the biggest advantage, but they are also causing the problem. And then I also showed that financial inflows into these countries are already existent. So you see that these countries are even more productive. So an inequality on top of an inequality on top of an inequality. We have differences of the impact of climate change around the world. Some countries have more time ahead. They contribute more to the problem, and they also benefit from financial inflows into these areas. And I only did this in order to show the disparate impact of climate change, and then find a model based or grounded on philosophical roots of Immanuel Kant, Hans Jonas, John Rawls, and Dimitri Nikolin, that you have a philosophical obligation to see this problem as a turning point, that you start redistributing some of the expected gains and losses of climate change around the world in such a way that those countries that benefit from climate change in the short run are also obliged to pay for climate change mitigation and adaptation in countries that have the most time or the least time ahead and the most damage already from climate change. And I have this very sophisticated model of how to redistribute via tax and bond strategies. And I factored in several impact factors, the geo impact of climate change, measured on loss and gain prospects, climate flexibility, how much can a country adapt and change, CO2 emissions, of course, and CO2 emission changes. But I also thought about the resilience capability of countries, how much can a country change, and how much do we have historical evidence that a country can adapt to climate change or can adapt financially to crisis, and hence here climate change. And then I also thought about finance diplomacy in consumption-based trade adjusted CO2 emissions, science diplomacy, and global economic connectivity of these countries, what country has the best means to become a leader in redistribution strategies. And as we can see, the climate change negotiations are actually pointing towards a direction like this, that only a few countries have maximum gains from climate change these days, and they are also obliged to lead in redistributing assets to countries that are the worst off the fastest. And then this project turned into really zooming into corporate sector applications, seeing market applications. We can already now say, for instance, over the entire world, water will become a scarcity in the next 10 years because it gets warmer and warmer, and the warmer it is, the harder it is to preserve water quality. We also already see that there's a switch from heating devices into cooling devices. So if you want to invest long term, better invest in devices that cool the air than into heating companies. But then I also looked into market applications, and there I'm at prices and at food prices. And what always puzzled me, you see here two graphs, food prices over a long time. In the downwards left one, you see the peak condition for different crops. When do they bloom? What is the best quality condition around them that certain crops can be harvested? And on the international level, you see upwards two graphs, commodities for cereals and beverages, so food and drink, the basic nutrition that underlies a lot of different food products. And here you see this puzzling effect that they were quite stable, but then you see these two peaks, and they are actually in the timeline. This was the time when we had the 2008 world financial crisis, and ever since then food is an elevated commodity. So we had this shock of the 2008 world financial crisis. It's not so clear why food is still high or on an elevated level. There is some indication that potentially the larger investment houses started focusing on assets, collaterals, and moving away from, for instance, housing market, but then looked at certain assets that are not so highly regulated, and food is one of them. The regulation of food intake is regulated, so what kind of food you eat. But in terms of market speculation, food is not on the radar, or not the number one regulated financial asset. And that potentially caused the finance sector to somewhat go into speculation with food. But when you concern that in certain countries, people, so it's the cheapest to eat in the Western world compared to your relative income possibilities, and the most is consumed in countries or in relation to your income in third world countries. So when you have an elevated food price in the Western world, it's not potentially it's only going to hit marginalized groups, but the major body of population will still be able to afford food. Maybe not quality food, but still will have some food on the table. But if you look at these graphs and you see there's this elevated price, and you think of third world countries where people have to use more than 100% of their income to have food on the table, this graph is a problem. So there was this idea to zoom into food prices. What makes food prices move? And I wanted to largen it up and look at climate change, war and political conflicts, and financial crises. Three different drivers that can have an impact on food prices. And I look at particular cases of Russia's annexion of the Crimea and the invasion of the Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. And in terms of financial crises, I look at the 2008 world financial recession and the COVID pandemic. Did it change food prices? So in the overall model, first, I throw in everything and look into climate change, war, geopolitical conflicts, and financial crisis at once. And you can make the argument climate change, of course, drives up temperature. It leads to adverse effects in agriculture, droughts, floods, crop failures. In wars, you have problems, bottlenecks, you have inflation, you have disruption, and in financial crisis, you can say there's inflationary pressure and speculative activity, and unregulated food commodities might be a way to speculate. So I did two studies. First, a big overall regression over a 26-year period from 1994 to 2019, and put in climate change, war activities, and financial crises. And then I did event studies, saw geopolitical events and financial events, the invasion of the Crimea, Ukraine, and in financial cases of 2008 world financial recession and COVID. First of all, in the regression, I operationalized the climate change by the NASA Land-Ocean Index temperature. War destruction was estimated by the sum of death in armed conflicts around the world, and financial crises were measured by the metric Schmelzig banking crisis in intervention database. Like I changed a bit, or I did my own index, but the basic data was derived from the metric Schmelzig banking intervention crisis intervention database. And commodities prices were operationalized by Index Mundi Commodity Food and Beverage Price Index. So in the first study, yes, and then the second study was more event studies, and I took the time from 1990 until 2024, so quite a large or a long time. And I saw the impact of the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of Russia's takeover attempts of the Ukraine on cereal prices measured with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization cereal price index, and again the 2008 world financial recession and COVID downturn was operationalized by looking into how these events changed the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization cereal price food index. So in the first regression, I find interestingly that climate change is the highest changing and most chronic substantial impact on food prices. And the other events, political events, but also financial crisis, don't have a significant impact. So climate change is really changing food prices. But then when you zoom into the event studies for the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of Russia's takeover attempts of the Ukraine, we see a long-term elevation of both political events. So it does have an impact. If you throw it compared to climate change, the impact is not significant. But if you look just at this one data point and look into wartime activities in an event study, you can say there is a significant long-term impact of annexations of Crimea and outbreaks of wars. And then with the financial crisis, we also see a significant long-term price elevation of global food prices, and caused by systemic internal shocks to the financial world, as we can see here in the 2008 world financial crisis and 2022 COVID-19 external shocks. So either internal economic crisis or external shocks both have a significant long-term price elevation of global food prices. And overall, we can derive, and this is my final point that I want to make, overall we can derive there are policy recommendations of the short term, stabilization of food prices. We should potentially think of implementing price caps for essential commodities in order to not marginalize communities, even with the food prices and access to healthy nutrition. We should subsidize farmers to offset input costs increases. and there are potentials for strategic reserves, create national food reserves to mitigate shortages, especially in the threat of political action. And there are targeted subsidies, protect marginalized groups through direct income subsidies or help that they can have access to quality food. And in the last slide, I just want to say there are long-term implications and policy recommendations that we can derive. We can see that climate change is a problem compared to war and financial crisis. It is the major impact factor on food. We should start thinking deeply about energy sources diversification in order to overcome bottlenecks, especially when there are also budget constraints that hinder people from having access to quality food. We should promote sustainable agriculture, so we have like a long-term resilience in times of change, of climate change, of political upheaval and financial problems or financial constraints, and definitely also strengthen global cooperation. For we see this not only with climate change. Climate has no borders, but also with the geopolitical situation. We see that cooperation, diplomacy are still key to create stability also in the financial sector. International policies, international regulation, but also international cooperation with direct to food help or remittances, are care packages for countries that cannot afford food during crisis are still to this day key, and will hopefully help moving forward with a world that can still afford to eat and especially also eat healthy food. And with this, thank you so much. I very much look forward to your comments, and you can also find me online and comment by email if you have further thoughts. Thank you so much, and thank you so much. Nice greetings to Malta, and thank you so much for enabling me to be present online and virtually.